starved, tortured, and abused, failed by everyone from the parents to even child services, not shown love or even some pity, not even remorse from the abusers who happened to be his own grandparents. That's what Jeffrey Baldwin went through at his tender age of 5 before his life was cut short. Jeffrey and his older sister had undergone one of the worst inhuman experiences a child would ever live through until Jeffrey couldn't anymore. On the evening of November 30th, 2002, a phone call was made by Jeffrey's grandmother to the emergency services. On rushing to the location, they were met with a disturbing scene of the emaciated, lifeless body of the young boy. His siblings, however, survived to tell the story of what really happened in their grandparents' house. This is the heartbreaking story of Jeffrey Baldwin. Born on January 20th, 1997, in Toronto, Canada, Jeffrey Baldwin was the son of Yvonne Kidman and Richard Baldwin and had 2 older sisters and a younger brother. He was a happy, healthy, and normal child and weighed an average weight for a baby his age. Life was normal as well, however. His parents were usually troubled, and with allegations of abuse and violence being leveled against them, and with them still being teenagers, they were deemed not fit to raise children, leading them to lose the custody of their 4 children by the summer of 1998. With the blessing, or rather the curse, of the Toronto Catholic Children's Aid Society, the children's care and well-being was handed over to the maternal grandparents, that is, Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman, where life drastically changed, going from bad to the worst, especially for young Jeffrey and his older sister, who were for some unknown reason singled out as the bad kids. The oldest sister and the youngest brother were, however, considered the good kids and were treated normally, or if not, close to it. They were made to look down upon them and were warned by the grandparents not to talk about the other 2 to anyone, or even talk to them, or like them, and for that reason, they were terrified to do so. The oldest sister, understanding what was happening, still had pity and felt bad for them. A very energetic boy who loved Superman, who tried flying by jumping on and off chairs like every other kid his age did, was always joyful and loved being adventurous. One would never imagine that all that in one day was to be taken away from him. At that time, children were placed with immediate family members if the parents were not able to take care of them, so that the children could stay together and wouldn't have to be placed in group homes or under foster care. If a member of the children's extended family were able to take them, such as in this case the grandparents, it was seen as the most suitable solution. Elva, being a caregiver, was seen even better, as they believed that this was the right place for the children. Despite the 3-bedroomed household having 6 adults, that is the grandparents, their 2 daughters Yvette and Tammy, and their boyfriends to squeeze in with 6 children, that is the 4 siblings and their 2 cousins who were the children of Tammy, she would receive extra financial support for taking care of the children. What the child services didn't know, or didn't even try to find out, was that under the care of Norman and Elva, it was never a safe space, but rather a house full of agony. So what really happened behind the closed doors of this house, and what was the dark secrets that Norman and Elva had been covering for years? After Jeffrey's death and the shocking discovery of the state of his body and the conditions of the house, the children in the household were seized by the child services and sent to foster care, with the siblings ending up in a foster home under the care of an experienced foster mother. At first, cautious of their new surroundings, they were tight-lipped and couldn't even maintain eye contact for any length of time. But with time, and once they realized this was actually a safer place than where they were before, small bits of information came out from them revealing the traumatic events that they experienced. The foster mother recounted feeling both shocked and bewildered when they first asked if she had a pig wall and pig room in her house. The word pig apparently was a common phrase that was used to refer Jeffrey and his sister, who had gotten used to it. A photograph in which Jeffrey and his sister were sitting confined at a certain corner showed exactly what the children were describing as the pig wall. It's from there that if and when fed, they ate the leftovers of the meals that the rest of the people in the house had eaten, using a shared bowl which was called the pig bowl. This led to the malnourished state of their body, as they looked very small compared to children of their age, with their bodies having sores all over and developing distended bellies. On the second floor of the house was the bedroom in which Jeffrey and his sister spent every night and most of their days locked in, as if they were criminals. In here, there was no heat as the furnace vents were closed, and it was always dark, as the only window in the room was covered. They were usually not taken to hospital, and Jeffrey, unlike his sister and other siblings, didn't go to school as well. The reasoning behind this by the grandparents was that he was not well toilet trained. and therefore wouldn't be accepted. The sister was, however, threatened not to talk about Jeffrey and what they underwent at school, as the grandparents knew that the children's aid would come and seize all the children from them once they found out. They were not allowed to play outside like the other children. They had bright red skin on their legs, which was caused by urine washing down to their feet, as they did not use the bathroom most of the time. The room had an awful stench that could even stick on your clothes when you came out of it, as described by one of the detectives. This was often due to their waste being all over the place, and on squeezing the mattresses that they slept on, urine would come out of them. Elva forced them to help clean up their mess by making them scrub the walls and clean their beds, and if they didn't do it well, they were hit by the mop and told, and I quote, "Hurry up, you pigs!" Norman would hit them with his hand, a slipper, or a newspaper if they misbehaved. The oldest sister described the lickings she witnessed her younger siblings going through, where their grandfather spanked them with a metal spoon. They were lined up and had to remove their clothing and underpants, and when she asked him why they had to do that, she was answered so that they wouldn't bleed on the clothes. They were sometimes let out of the room for what was described as exercise, where they were basically forced to walk around the kitchen, and if they stopped, they were thrown objects at and called names the likes of pig and other abusive terms. And if you thought that this by far was the most evil level they could reach, well, it gets worse from here. The two children were not only deprived of good food, but also water, which reverted them to animal instinct, as on one occasion after their arrival to the new foster home, the girl was found drinking water from the toilet, an occurrence that horrified the foster mother. And when she asked her why she drank from the toilet, she simply answered that that was where she and her brother used to drink water from in the previous house. She explained further that they had to wash themselves and their underwear using the toilet water, and that it was the idea of their grandmother. Another occurrence was when the girl was eating very quickly at the dining table, as she had an insatiable appetite. The foster mother heard the youngest one saying that if she puked it, she had to eat it, because at their grandmother's house that's what they did. At school, some of her teachers thought that something was amiss, as she would often smell like urine, and during snack times, her insatiable appetite was in display. The teachers, having concerns about the young girl, however, chose not to report anything about the matter. And with the children also afraid to share what they went through, this meant that no one could rescue them. Around the year 2000, one of the workers from the Catholic Children's Aid Society made a short visit to Elva and Norman's household, which had been the first visit in a long time. During the visit, the worker had noticed that there had been a bruise under Jeffrey's eye. Had the worker done their due diligence, the children could have been immediately taken, and young Jeffrey would probably still be alive to this day. The injury had, however, been quickly dismissed as a small accident, and no action was taken to further investigate Jeffrey and his siblings' home life with their grandparents. The oldest sister further revealed that the only time she ever recalled seeing Jeffrey smile was when their parents visited them, a thing that didn't really happen often as one would think. Unlike Yvonne's two sisters and their boyfriends who lived in that house and did nothing to help the children but rather watch them suffer and Jeffrey dying slowly, Richard and Yvonne didn't live there and had limited access to their own kids, which was controlled by the highly manipulative grandmother. A long manipulative plan to take over the care of the children had for years been in play. The moment problems had started arising, the child services were involved, as Yvonne and Richard had left one of their children unattended. The child was supposed to stay with the grandparents for only a couple of months as the parents fixed their issues. Long before they knew it, they had already filed for custody 2 months in, and with the help of the Catholic Children's Aid Society, they got it. Elva was secretly recording their phone calls and taking notes of them, all in an effort to prove that they were unfit, eventually getting what she wanted, the children's custody. Question is, though, didn't they notice Jeffrey's physical state during their visits? Well, apparently they did. And on questioning Elva why Jeffrey was smaller, even to the point his younger brother was outgrowing him, and why he hadn't been potty trained yet, she always had an answer for everything, or as I would say, a manipulative excuse for this. She claimed that everyone always thought that Jeffrey would grow up to be short, since there were a lot of short people in the family. She further argued that it was the steroids in the cream that his younger brother used for his eczema condition, which made him grow faster than Jeffrey. Only thing left to do, according to them, was to just trust her word, even after they were banned from entering their room, and also after discovering that it was mostly locked. Oddly enough, they were told by Elva herself that the children were drinking from the toilet, and on asked if this did not make them concerned, this is what they had to say.
Didn't that cause you to be a little bit concerned?
We voiced concerns, but then all we get is arguments, and basically, if you don't like the way things look, leave.
The same ultimatum was also given to everyone else in the house who tried to voice their concerns. James Mills, Yvette's boyfriend who lived with them, gave his statement saying he always thought the treatment of Jeffrey and his sister was deplorable as they were treated and lived like dogs, while the other children in the household were treated completely different, even the ones that Elva babysat from outside. He had told her on a number of times to get help for Jeffrey as he tried to protest for him due to Jeffrey's skinny frame that kept on getting worse. However, she declined, insisting that it would ruin her check as those kids were $600 to her every month. In short, all she cared about was the extra money that she received that was intended to help her raise them in a good environment and the best way possible, but instead, it was the other way round. With him not paying the rent of the house, he knew if he further insisted on the matter, he would be kicked out. Trying to talk to his girlfriend so that she could try talking to her parents was in vain, as she too was afraid of raising the issue, and would even spark an argument as she asked him in a rather peculiar way, "What do you want me to do?" James and Jeffrey's oldest sister had shared their memories of the days before Jeffrey passed away. The sister described how the day before he died, that Elva wrapped him in a blanket and set him in front of the TV, but he wasn't able to keep his head up as it kept falling down. Elva, however, brushed it off, assuming he was just being lazy, not knowing what was really happening. James had been watching him the nights before as he crawled up the stairs too weak to even walk on his own, his little pajamas falling off because he had no hips. He knew that his condition was really bad, and Jeffrey's life was in deep trouble. As he was playing video games in the next room, he heard coughing and sobbing coming from the locked room where Jeffrey spent his last moments in. Afraid to risk his free stay at the house, he did nothing. And on the evening of November 30th, 2002, Jeffrey succumbed to his poor health conditions, with the cause of death being as a result of septic shock and bacterial pneumonia. However, it was also evident that he had suffered due to prolonged starvation and abuse. The grandmother, as mentioned earlier on in the video, called the medical services, saying that her grandson was not breathing. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics instantly became aware that Jeffrey had been abused. A report was made by a pathologist, Dr. Gregory Wilson, where he stated that his body was covered in bruises, sores and abrasions, and he was starved for a long period of time, that he only weighed 21 pounds or around 9.5 kilograms, which was even less than his weight at his first birthday. Jeffrey had no muscle tone or body fat, and his clothes were always falling off of him because he was so skeletal. Additionally, he had ulcers on his genitals, and a few days before his death, a fecal bacteria had gotten into his bloodstream, causing septic shock that would have made it difficult for him to breathe. Jeffrey had most likely placed his fingers into his mouth, transferring the bacteria into his lungs. A pediatric nutritionist, Dr. Stanley Zlotkin, examined Jeffrey's case and stated that in all his years of research in third world countries at the time, he had never seen a child that was starved and stunted to such an extent. With immediate effect, the children in the household were all seized and placed under foster care by the Catholic Children's Aid Society, where the siblings ended up under the care of the foster mother, as stated earlier. Toronto police were immediately on the case, of course, but it was complicated by the fact that the Catholic Children's Aid Society were involved in the family's collective life, Jeffrey's 3 siblings and 2 young cousins being seized and placed in foster care, and some changes in the homicide squad. It must have seemed to Elva and Norman that nothing much was happening, as they had not yet been arrested and thought they had got away with the murder, and so they got themselves busy. The room where Jeffrey and his sister used to be locked up in was cleaned up and painted. With the new look, no one would have guessed what heinous atrocities took place in there, where the 2 urine and feces stained mattresses that when pressed fluid would gush out had once served as beds of continuous pain and suffering for Jeffrey and his sister. There were now proper beds with pillows and warm blankets. They, apparently with their high degree of audacity, had done the makeover ready to welcome back the 3 siblings home. Around the same time as well, Bottineau was back in family court trying to get back Jeffrey's siblings out of foster care and back in her home. However, she and her husband were arrested later that month on March 19, 2003, and charged with second-degree murder and forcible confinement, with the former's charge in relation to Jeffrey's death and the latter's for the locking up of his sister. During their interviews with the investigators, they didn't say anything at all, as they showed no emotion and no remorse when they were shown photos of Jeffrey. On further investigations, revelations of their seemingly dark past records were uncovered. A deed that, if it had been carried out by the Catholic Children's Aid Society, would have ruled them out of being given the responsibility of raising, let alone the Baldwin siblings, but any child at all. A background check on them would have shown them that Elva had a child abuse conviction back in 1970, with her own daughter Eva being the victim. The 5-month-old baby had died of pneumonia in 1969, and on further investigation of Eva's death, it was discovered that she had multiple fractures on her body. It had even made it to the local newspaper as a major story that shocked many at the time, with Elva being sentenced to 1 year of probation. In 1978, Norman was convicted of assaulting 2 of Elva's children from a previous relationship and was given a sentence of 2 years of probation. The 2 children had undergone the same cruel treatment that Jeffrey and his sister experienced before being seized by the same child services that helped the 2 to get custody of the 4 children 2 decades later. One of the children, Fred, shared his experience.
As a child, I can remember being, stuffed into a dog cage. Me and my sister being put into a metal dog bin.
He and his sister were shown nothing but abuse in that house. They, similarly to Jeffrey and his sister, reverted to animal instinct.
It sounds gross, but I have to say it, but when they go to flush the toilet, there's clean water. Well, we assumed was clean water. The toilet was never, all that clean, to be honest. But you take out what you could with your hand and drink it out of your hand.
Same thing and similar experiences, only 2 decades apart. The same child services agency was also involved and ever present in that apartment. The caseworker for the agency knew they were being beaten and would argue with Elva to get her act together and take care of them, but it ended there, as there was no evidence that the Children's Aid took any action. And according to Fred, the visits made by the caseworker were another excuse for Elva and Norman's thrashings.
And the minute she was gone, the door would unlock and we'd get beaten because she'd end up showing up because of us screaming or carrying on.
What led to them being saved was when Fred's sister showed up to school with bruises forcing the Child's Aid to act, as the children were taken and put up for adoption. As mentioned earlier, Norman was arrested and given the 2-year probation after being fined only $300 when he pleaded guilty. However, he still stayed with the family, which at this point had grown to include their 3 daughters, with the Child's Aid always monitoring. By the 80s, Elva Bottineau had already been through 2 psychological evaluations, and both of them stated that Elva should not be in care of children, and therefore she shouldn't have been deemed fit to even take care of her daughters. Surprisingly, she was now even sponsored by the Child's Aid as a daycare giver, as they paid her to even take care of other people's children. This would also lead to them being helped to get custody of the Baldwin siblings, as mentioned earlier. The investigators weren't the only ones surprised with how careless the Child's Aid was in helping them get the custody. Elva's son, Fred, had some years before Jeffrey's death re-established contact with her, trying to find answers as to why she treated them with such cruelty, only to discover that despite having been allowed to raise 3 more children, she now even had her grandchildren living with her.
She told me she had custody of all 4 kids. I'm like, how did you get custody of all 4 kids?
And you were surprised because...
Because of the fact that she actually got adoption of those kids. After all me and my sister went through, and this lady is still able to keep 3 kids, plus take on the adoption of the other 4 kids. I'm sorry, I don't have the highest grade in high school or the highest education, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. It's like there's something wrong.
That was also the time he saw the state of Jeffrey as well.
His ribs would be all sunken, his arms were really thin and skinny. That triggered an alarm in me. I was like that.
You remember looking like that?
Oh, of course.
So when you saw Jeffrey and you had concerns, did you think maybe I should go to the authorities? Maybe I should go to Children's Aid? Maybe I should warn them about this woman if they don't know?
I thought of it, but at the same point, it was the thing that kept coming back to me was that, look, she's got Children's Aid knows that they're here. Normally they do their checkups and whatever occasionally, I don't know why they wouldn't have seen something like that happening. Maybe I should have said something or done something, but I didn't.
The court declared they had kept Jeffrey and his sister locked in a bedroom where he lived in his own feces and left them to drink from a toilet. The judge was told that the pair used the children as a source of income, collecting government support checks, while offering little or none in return. 3 years later, on April 7, 2006, they were convicted of second-degree murder by Justice David Watt in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, with the sentencing being delivered on June 9, 2006. Elva Bottineau was sentenced to 22 years in prison, that is until 2028, and Norman Kidman 20 years, that is until 2026, before they respectively become eligible for parole. The Catholic Children's Aid Society claimed to have no previous knowledge of the grandparents' child abuse conviction from the 70s, and they stated that they only learned of this fact in 2002, after Jeffrey had died. There had been, however, a record of the abuse conviction in the Children's Aid Society's own files. For whatever reason, the agency had claimed to have no knowledge about Elva and Norman's child abuse records at the time of the children's placement with them. Perhaps they knew, but they just didn't care, or wouldn't admit for obvious reasons. At the time, the Ministry of Children and Youth Services didn't have a requirement to look into child welfare records when it came to putting children with their extended family. Ontario believed that family preservation meant everything, even if it was detrimental to the child to be placed with certain relatives, as was the case with Jeffrey and his siblings. Michael Davis, a detective investigating the case, told the coroner's counsel that he would have charged every single adult that lived in that home for their negligence. However, the Provincial Child and Family Services Act, while imposing on all citizens the duty to report if they suspect a child is suffering, they couldn't be punished as only professionals such as doctors, nurses, teachers and social workers that may be involved with children can be charged under the Act, and only they are subject to a fine not exceeding $1,000 at the time. As for criminal charges, he said, only those with the duty of care, meaning Bottineau and Kidman, could be charged. The detective, however, wasn't the only witness who thought the witless adults who lived in that house and watched the destruction of that child without lifting a finger to help were responsible in his death. Osiris Villalobos, the after-hours child aids worker who visited the home with the police after leaving the hospital, wept on the witness stand as he remembered the stench of Jeffrey's sad room and how the smell of urine was so strong that it stayed on his clothes. The room, he said, was totally different from the other bedrooms in the small house, where the adults and the favoured children lived completely different. He would have also charged them if it were up to him, he added, while wiping his tears. Osiris wasn't involved in the case file and the agency's failure to check the records of Elva and Norman. Jeffrey's paternal grandmother, Susan Demetriadis, testified as she stated that all her desperate attempts to see her grandson were ignored by the child's aid, and that if she had gotten the chance, she would have taken him without even caring about the police coming after her. Elva and Norman had made appeals, but in March 3, 2011, the Court of Appeal for Ontario dismissed both of them. Bottineau's lawyer had argued that she wasn't smart enough to realise Jeffrey would die, and Kidman, for some unknown reason, had asked the court to quash his murder conviction and instead send him to prison for manslaughter. In January 19, 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada decided not to hear any other appeal from Elva. In September 9, 2013, a coroner's inquest into Jeffrey's death was started. The main goal of the inquest was not to place blame on those involved, but to explore the systemic issues that had taken place in relation to Jeffrey's death. The reason why the inquest took place more than a decade after Jeffrey had died was because Elva Bottineau had exhausted all of her appeals the previous year. There have been a great deal of changes in the child welfare system since Jeffrey Baldwin's death, in which the Catholic Children's Aid Society stated that Elva and Norman's horrific child abuse convictions would not go unnoticed if he was to be placed in that home after these changes took place. In February 14, 2014, the coroner's jury ruled the boy's death a homicide and delivered 103 recommendations. The Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies and the Children's Aid Societies both conducted reviews of the recommendations that were directed towards all the Ontario's Children's Aid Societies. These recommendations required the Child Services to do a thorough background check of criminal records and identify the caregiver's identity. The new changes to the child welfare system meant that relatives who became caregivers would be subjected to the same standards as adoptive and foster parents. They would need to go through family history, background, and record checks to ensure that they could provide adequate care in a decent environment and, most importantly, a good home. Despite the fact that he lived a short life, he will still be remembered for his boisterous energy, beautiful smile, and being a lovely boy. A bronze statue of him, dressed as his favourite superhero Superman, was put in Greenwood Park in Toronto to honour his memory, and as a symbol to everyone to show how important it is to be diligent and shed light to child abuse, with a strong reminder that children should get better treatment and, most importantly, to be shown love, the love that unfortunately Jeffrey Baldwin and his sister were not given. If you found this video compelling, be sure to drop a like and leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.